Hello, and welcome back to plantcare.club, where we care about your plants. My name is Fred. On this show, we'll answer your questions. We will do product reviews, and we will talk about your plants, everything you have, indoor, outdoor. I was blanking on the first one there. First one, third one, they're all the same sort of thing. So this show is all about talking about the plants you have, indoor, outdoor. My background is I work with our family farm, and we have a farm in Ontario, Canada, as well as one in Homestead, Florida. We grow everything from hanging baskets, patio pots, all the way down to 4-inch flats, annuals, that kind of a thing, garden mums, poinsettias. We grow Kimberly Queen Ferns, Mandevilla, Majesty Palms, all of those items. So the point of this show is to take the information that we have at the nursery or at the greenhouse level and tell you how you can apply that to your own home or your own plants when you're actually shopping for plants, whatever you're going to be doing. So on today's show, and something that I've kind of talked about for the last, a couple of times in the last few weeks, I think, is we want to do a cost of growing series to kind of talk about what is the cost of the plants that you might be buying at your local grocery store, or when you are, local grocery store, or garden center, wherever you may be picking up your plants, to give you an idea of what are, what's actually being input into it, what you're paying for, how much does it really cost, are you being ripped off, or are you getting a lot of bang for your buck? What are you looking at there? So on the first show, and I'm going to move myself over here. On the first show, we want to talk about some of the easier items. It's easier to map out the costs of some of the nursery items from Florida. Florida, or let's say California. Some of these plants that are grown in high heat areas, like Majesty Palms, Kimberly Queen Ferns. So these are two very relatively basic items. And why do I say basic? Because most of the time you take a pot soil, one or a couple of plants, you put them into the soil, and all you have to do is fertilize and spray and give it time. And because of those things, by the time it gets all the way to the end and you get into the fall, that's when you actually, you get into the spring, that's when you're actually going to sell the product. So there's not as much going on as there is when you get into some of the greenhouse grown items. With a greenhouse grown item, there's more input costs. It becomes a little bit more complex in that way. So, starting off with 10-inch Majesty Palms, 10-inch Kimberly Queen Ferns. Two relatively basic items. Now, the classic three starting points are pot, soil, and your plant. All of the costs that you see here, and if you are listening, the cost of a pot is 45 cents, roughly. Soil, let's say about $1.15. And the actual liner that you're going to buy is about $1.30. Now, these are all rough costs. And that's because it's going to depend on the size of your order, the size of your farm, and how big of an order you're putting in. If you're putting in an order for 5,000 liners versus one for 1,000,000 liners, there's going to be a very big difference in the cost to actually receive that product. So, and that applies to your pot and your soil as well. These are probably on the higher end, and I'm trying to give you the higher end costs because it gives you a better idea of what your local garden center might actually be paying if they decided to grow these plants. The pots are usually just black blow mold pots. This is about as cheap as you can get. Now, the more you buy, obviously, the cheaper it's going to get. So you can get all the way down to let's say 30 cents, somewhere close to, sometimes you hear even lower than that, depending on deals and where they're coming from. So you can get cheaper and cheaper items there. Your soil, you can definitely get cheaper grades of soil. The problem with it though is if you start to pay less for soil, you can get a real difference in quality, which can start to affect the plant down the line. So you can pay less and get heavier soil, but that heavy soil isn't going to let the water drain as well. And now all of a sudden your roots are more susceptible to fungus, bacteria, anything else that can live inside that soil. And of course your plant. This is a rooted liner, so it's not cutting. It's the tissue culture that arrives. It gets rooted into a liner. Once that liner actually has some roots and it can be shipped off, the employee at the nursery is just going to take the liner out, put it directly into the soil, and there you go. So at this point, Majesties and Kimberleys are relatively similarly priced. The liner costs for Majesties can be a bit higher than a Kimberly, but it really just depends on when you're getting it, who you're getting it from, how big your orders are, all of those items there. They make a big difference. Okay, fertilizer is the next one that I have on this list. So I have it down at about 30 cents. Same principle. If you're buying more, it's going to be a bit cheaper. It is also going to be grower dependent. So you can get away with using less fertilizer if you let the plant grow for longer. So you're going to have that kind of a trade-off here where some people will start their Majesty Palms in as early as like first week of June. And the plan is to sell them the following March, April, May. So it's 9 months to 11, 12 months of growing. And if you do that, you can probably cut down your fertilizer costs a little bit. Your plant is going to be really big, it's going to be huge, it's going to look great. But if you are trying to condense that, let's say you wanted to plant them in August, you might have to use a little bit more fertilizer to push that plant along and get it all the way up to the spot where it's going to be looking great for the spring. Your chemicals, here's another one that is going to be very different depending on the grower. Some growers will want to spray very often, and they're going to be spraying for bugs as a preventative. I'll loop biologicals into this as well. So you've got bios and chemicals. Maybe you are putting on a preventative bio rather than spraying with a chemical every week. Now, if you start to see bugs in your plants, your chemical costs are going to increase. You're going to have to spray more often, and that's just going to, rack this up. I've got a blanket 30 cents applied to this per pot, which I think is a little bit generous, especially with these varieties, but it gives you an okay idea of what you're working with here. Growing space. So this is going to be different depending on where you are in the United States or in South America or really wherever you are in the world. Every different spot is going to have different costs per acre. So let's say you're renting a piece of land and it is $20,000 an acre. Or no, let's say $10,000 an acre. That's a little bit more realistic in let's say South Florida, somewhere with a lot of heat. It can be really expensive there. And at that cost, you put on a few thousand plants on that acre of land, and now you have to divide up the total cost of rent by how many plants you have there. It gives you a cost of growing. Now you can move further north. You can go north of the Everglades. That's a decent option of somewhere that you can go. But then you start to run into the chances of a frost. And if you get a frost, all of a sudden your plants get knocked back a little bit. So you have to trim off the damaged leaves. You might have to cut the plant back. And now, instead of being ahead by a month, now you're behind by a month or so. So there's a bit of a gamble the further north you go. And if you do decide to go further north and you say, I'm going to get around the frost by putting up a greenhouse structure, that's fine, but the greenhouse structure is going to have a lot of costs as well. So there's no easy way of doing it. And this is probably the squishiest number that I have here. I have 80 cents as your growing space cost. This could be way higher for some people. It could be way lower for other people. The other thing that you have to remember here is there's a lot of farms that are second, third, fourth generation, something like that. And they might not have to pay for land. They might have their land already paid off. They don't have a mortgage. They don't have rent. They don't have any of these payments. So if you take these numbers and you drop that right down to zero, it really affects your final total cost of the plant. Next up is labor. So we're really getting into some of these squishier numbers that are just so variable based on where you are, how good your processes are, everything else. I have a blanket number of $1 here, which I think is a reasonable guess as to how much it's going to be. Usually, the labor includes, first off, filling the pot, then putting the liner into the pot. You have a little bit of time for fertilizing, spraying, that kind of thing. Then you have to space out your plants. Next, your second to last step is going to be actually taking that plant and putting it onto a trailer so that it can be moved to the loading area. And your last step is probably going to be cleaning that plant. So that's 5, 6 different steps in there. And I only said, spraying it once. You could be spraying it relatively often. So there is a decent amount of labor that goes into this. However, when you start to look at the efficiencies that some people will have, you'll see some nurseries or growers that have like tractors that will go in. They'll pick up multiple pots all at once with kind of forks, and they can move them across to a different area, set them down, and they're already perfectly spaced. Or you can have the use of conveyor belts. Like conveyor belts will really help with spacing and moving in that way. There are some places that are able to plant everything on a conveyor belt line. So the pot gets put onto a line, it gets by one person, it gets filled, it gets planted, it gets set down and spaced all in one shot. So now all of a sudden your labor costs are starting to drop. This is a really squishy metric. It's a really squishy number. Putting $1 on here might be underestimating for some people, overestimating for others. So it's just a good guess. At the end of the day, I got $5.30 for both a Majesty Palm and a Kimberly Queen Fern. Now, some other things to remember are the Majesty is going to take longer to grow. So for most people, it is a June, maybe a July crop. Starts very early, and it's pretty intensive. It takes a lot of fertilizer, heat, time to grow. So that number is probably a little bit higher. For the Kimberly, same idea. You are probably, sorry, not the same idea. You're going to start the Kimberly a little bit later in the season, maybe September, October, somewhere in that range. So you get to save a little bit on your timing there. The Kimberly might be a little bit cheaper than a Majesty, but as I said, all of these numbers are very squishy and able to be changed from farm to farm. But really, what's the point? Well, what the point of this is, for the farm, you're looking at somewhere between, let's say, around $5 to $6 for one of these units. Well, and that's the farm's cost. The farm will probably then sell it to a broker or directly to a garden center or a chain. And the further away from the farm it goes, the more expensive it's going to start to get. So because most of them come from South Florida, let's say this plant is going all the way up to Canada. That's a good example for us. It's going to touch a broker. It's going to go into Canadian dollars. It has to be repackaged and resold in Canada. And at the end of the day, your Kimberly Queen Fern is probably going to sell for about $21. Your Majesty Palm is probably going to be sold for about $24, somewhere in there. You will see some better deals where like maybe it's $15 and $18 something like that. But at the beginning of the season, you're probably going to see a $20 number on both of a Kimberly and a Majesty. The further south you go, maybe if you're in South Florida, you might be able to see each of these for 10 bucks, 10 bucks a pot, United States dollars. So it's going to depend on where you are, but I'm hoping that this gives you an idea of how things work on the grower and the nursery side and what they're looking for, how they can save, and also how things are priced. When you actually go to the grocery store and you see these numbers thrown on a Majesty or a Kimberly, you can say now, oh, I get why, because here are some of the costs that'll all go into it. If you have any questions, please send them over to plantcare.club or leave them in the comments somewhere, and I will talk to you guys again next time. Thanks. Bye.